Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. In this episode we're going to be discussing chemical weapons. It might seem like an odd topic as unlike the First World War, which saw the deployment of gas, chemical weapons were not used in the Second World War, but there was fear of their use. Everyone carried a gas mask. The belligerent nations had huge chemical weapons programs working throughout the war. I'm joined by Brett Edwards. Brett is a senior lecturer at Bath University. He is also host of the podcast Poisons and Pestilence. But before we kick off, just a quick reminder, this podcast is brought to you by the small donations from listeners like yourself. $1 or $2 every month from each of you goes a long way to helping me find the time to put the show together. The band of loyal listeners do not go unrewarded. No, for instance, I was able to make available to patrons of the show an extra 27 minutes of Jonathan Trigg and I discussing issues around Operation Barbarossa. To find out more, go to patreon.com/WW2podcast. It's a big thank you to those who support the podcast each month with a small contribution. It really is appreciated. Brett, thanks for joining me. So we're going to be discussing chemical weapons. Gas it's first used during the First World War. How was it viewed in 1918? Was it seen to have been a war-winning weapon?
You've got a situation where the various states have all developed different types of weapon system. And these are all designed to kind of break trench warfare. And it was a dedicated program. It was also a bit ad hoc. So you have stories of certain militaries receiving stuff at the front from well-meaning chemists and so on back home and been like, well, please, stop sending this. It's really not helping. If you go to the Somme today, there's a chemical weapon destruction facility. And I went there a while ago, and this was just at Ypres. The strange thing was I expected the munitions that they have to be very uniform, and particularly the chemical munitions that they were the stories they were mass produced, right? But actually, it's a real hodgepodge. So they have their chemical weapon library, which is basically all these different types of shells. And depending on which factory made in which part of the UK, there's a real variety. And the funny thing is that the local farmers, of course, have been pulling these things out of the ground for years. So they often have a pretty good idea which ones to kick to one side and which ones to stay well alone. But anyway, so after the First World War, of course, you demonstrated that mustard in particular was a particularly effective weapon, phosgene as well. And you have to remember that in the 1920s, there was this kind of uncertainty. So on the one hand, in places like Abyssinia, you were seeing the utilization of these weapon systems against people without defences. And so you were seeing, to quell insurgencies, basically, the Italian Air Force drop these things on people. But at the same time, others were kind of arguing, well, chemical warfare was this thing we developed for this particular conflict, and so it wasn't sure. So you had the establishment of like the UK, Porton Down, for example, which kind of was trying to find its way. And so throughout the 20s and 30s, you saw the refinement of these new weapon systems, but it wasn't necessarily clear what was going to happen. And this focused on stuff you breathe in, so harassing agents, things like nerve gas, so things like tear gas, but then you also had other agents like chlorine and phosgene that you breathed in and would cause you, would often suffocate you and cause horrific damage to the lungs and eyes. Then you'd also have things like mustard, which were an aerial denial weapon, so basically that covers the ground, you get that on your skin, it causes huge blisters, you can breathe it in, and those sorts of things.
And that's what the gas cape's for, isn't it? The mustard.
Exactly, yeah. So that stuff's terrible because it completely blankets the ground. And so, for example, the stuff is horrible. It breaks down over long periods of time. So to give you an example, I was speaking to someone who worked at all these destruction facilities, and they were saying that they picked up a large shell, didn't know it was mustard, rolled it into the back of a van. It was wrapped in plastic, but the plastic hadn't. And the two of them both got really severe burns. And this is 100 years later. But yes, this stuff was nasty. It was called the king of chemical weapons, and it was even hypothesized back then by certain individuals that you weren't going to get better than mustard. Mustard was as bad as it was going to get. Now, as it happens, this wasn't the case. So you had, in preparations for the Second World War, the British, the French, Germans, Americans, Russians, they all stockpiled chemical weapons.
Was that because they'd seen it as a war-winning weapon, or did they stockpile it because they thought it, if they're going to use it, we use it? I'm not sure how successful chemical weapons were when you come out of the First World War. At which point, do they just have them because we feel we've got to have them because they've got them?
Well, the main utility of them was deterrent. So it was this idea that no single state seemingly had a overwhelming chemical weapon advantage. So what happened is after the First World War, states acknowledged that each other had these weapon systems, and you saw the kind of gentlemen's agreements emerge that basically, no first use among people who signed up to the conventions. And so there was this idea that there was a line that could be crossed and you couldn't go back. And all states then were kind of hesitant to employ these weapons. And all states had a kind of deterrent position on it, which basically was, if in European theatre you employ these things, we have a force, we could reply in kind. And of course, this is a war in which you saw firebombing of cities. So, I mean, if you think about the image of the Second World War, the image is a civilian in a gas mask, right? And the concern from the 1920s was the fact that you basically, mustard in particular, and chlorine and phosgene are horrible. But if you have troops which are prepared, trained, there will be injuries and there'll be fatalities, but it won't necessarily be overwhelming. However, you utilize these weapon systems above a civilian population, the effects will be catastrophic. And so the idea was basically that you had this deterrent capability. So it's talked about, for example, that Winston Churchill, the claim that I've read in a few different places now is this idea that when in drawing up plans for potential German invasion, the idea was basically they would dump everything they had on the beaches as the Germans came on land, if they ever did invade. And if that had happened, those beaches would still be contaminated. I mean, now, environmentally, it would have been a complete disaster. I mean, you still get cases now in Asia where old stocks appear and they're dug up and they end up killing people because the ground's contaminated with this stuff. So in Europe, you didn't see the use of these weapons. There were stockpiles. As I understand it, I mean, you had like chemical warfare troops going abroad, going D-Day and stuff. These people were there. You had capabilities there. Luckily, and primarily by historical accident, we didn't see large-scale use in Europe. Of course, there is some isolated instance, particularly in resistance operations, where people have got hold of stuff and utilize that as part of improvised explosive and those sorts of things. Yeah, so this is the reason that they weren't maintained as a kind of deterrent. No side saw them as a winning weapon, but every side saw the necessity to maintain a deterrent sort of capability.
Because the other thing that I was interested in, go back to that interwar period, is it only Ethiopia that uses Ethiopia? Is it only Italy that uses it in the interwar period? We don't. I had a feeling that we'd used it in Afghanistan, but I can't find any. I must have misread it somewhere else. But
okay, so there's a couple. I haven't got the list in front of me, but you have the Rif War. There's claims of use. Abyssinia, there's use, and for example, in the 1930s, you saw the UK were trying to support the White Russians. They were trying to do an extraction, and Churchill had advocated the use of chemical weapons as part of that. He was very pro chemical weapons. Again, for whatever reason, this didn't come to pass. But there was certainly the history of chemical warfare in the interwar years is this idea of there was significant experiment use and consideration of the use of these weapons against particularly unprotected troops in colonial areas. That was the main.
It's interesting that it's being used on people that they know can't use it back on them.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, so if you look at the in Abyssinia, by the end they basically had tanks off planes. They were dropping the stuff. It wasn't like it was small shells. They had aerial superiority. But this all ties in, of course, again to the kind of emergence or solidification of this idea of chemical weapons being this indiscriminate weapon system. And so, it's no coincidence in the 20s and 30s you see this prohibition solidifying. So states basically no first use, and that's why they had this deterrent capability.
So even though it's been developed as it's a deterrent, but do they work on? I mean, famously in the First World War, it's not. It's a bit hit and miss when it's used. The wind changes and it does different. Are they working on? Because it strikes me that the biggest problem is not necessarily the biggest problem. The bit of using it is actually getting the stuff to where it needs to be in an efficient manner that's not going to affect your own troops.
Yeah, this is exactly right. I mean, so the army officers, the military culture, didn't really trust the stuff. In the First World War, of course, I think they were saying that it's 1 in 3 shells were chemical by the end that they were utilising. It was never internalized as a way of doing warfare. It never became conventional. And I think for this reason, it was also seen as a competitor, I think, to other, of course, then you have in the competition with the military organizations and those sorts of things, competing for resources. Of course, the First World War, as you know, you have weapon systems coming out of that, which are revolutionary and which are requiring resources. At the same time, you also have individuals talking about continued value of the horse and those sorts of things. So there's a lot of stuff going on.
The tank and the aeroplane are quite exciting. Chemical weapons are not necessarily quite so thrilling, perhaps, an arm to be in.
No, I think that's exactly right. Luckily, they stayed weird, at least in the European theatre. They stayed unusual and they stayed something that was kept in reserve. And I think you could compare that situation to the use of mustard by Japan in Manchuria. And there, of course, there was no retaliatory capacity, and so these things were used and dumped as well in large amounts around China. There's still sites turning up from that conflict where they find stockpiles of mustard in particular, which is again nasty stuff.
It's interesting that they use it on the Chinese, who are probably unprepared, but they don't necessarily use it on the British. Or if they do, you don't hear it in the British histories, which I assume if they did use it against the British or the Americans, would have heard all about it.
That's exactly right. And also it was made very clear at the time that this would not be tolerated. Well, there's 2 aspects, isn't there? There's the strategic, and as I understand it, the Japanese didn't have the resource or a large enough chemical weapons program to have employed that against the Americans. And the Americans entered the Second World War with the largest stock of chemical warfare agents. It would have taken them a while to get them where they needed to be. But Japan could have been ensured that if the US had turned itself to employing chemical warfare, it could have done so in an overwhelming way, and certainly within a few years could have increased production significantly. And I think in part it was this reason that Japan never utilized, at least I'm aware of, chemical weapons against US forces. If you move away from the large scale systematic use and towards unconventional forms of warfare, like chemical weapons, as we know, have a long history as a clandestine special operations weapon. And even though they would still be covered by the laws of war and those sorts of things, and then we don't do that sort of thing. And there's some evidence that even that the British have, in particular, even the British, I can speak about that a little bit. They have at times avoided utilizing weapons that were available to them because it was seen as not, even if it was a special operation, something they didn't want to get associated with or caught doing. There is some discussion of the fact that the special operations units associated with the UK military in the Second World War may have, at the very least, considered and hypothesized potential uses of different types of agent. There is also one accusation, which is a spurious accusation, that somehow, I think it was a Botox-covered hand grenade was utilised in the assassination of a general. And again, it's one of those stories which its intrigue value seems to transcend its factual basis. But that's,
Are all the sort of belligerent nation governments putting money aside somewhere to develop chemicals? I was sort of thinking, especially Germany, they're banned from doing so much things under Versailles. Do they just halt development, or do they just do nothing until sort of Hitler comes to power and in 1933, 34 they pump money in? Or
most of the chemical weapon agents we have, particularly from those early years, are agents which often have at the very least, a relationship with industrial applications, and that's often how they're picked up. So you find something that has an application as an insecticide, and then a military organization gets hold of that information and then may decide that that's something worth exploring. And so certainly, in the interwar period, you saw work like this. Now, the Germans obviously pursued a chemical weapons program. During the Second World War, they discovered the second generation of warfare agents, basically sarin, Somon, and the related nerve agents. The UK had also been working on its nerve agent, but it just wasn't as good. And a testament to this is the fact that by the time when the UK found out what Germany had been doing and the US found out, they basically abandoned their own candidate and just pursued sarin. And now the Germans developed their nerve agent program because they assumed that during the interwar years and during the war that the British and the Americans would be very advanced in their nerve agent capabilities by that point. And when these people were eventually picked up after the war, the Germans were picked up by the scrubbed clean by the UK and US intelligence people, the Germans were incredibly surprised to find out that actually in the West they'd very much lagged behind in this area.
What's the difference? Did you find nerve agent as opposed to just phosgene or anything else?
A nerve agent is a agent which typically affects the human metabolism. And so you have an agent which binds to and interrupts a chemical process that occurs in the communication between nerves. And so that can then cause nerves to go into constant processes of spasm. So a nerve agent is something which interrupts the central nervous system of the body. Usually it leads to things like, eventually it will paralyze the heart, it will suppress breathing, leads to muscle spasms and those sorts of things. And these things they kill, that's what they do. So they are also usually non-persistent. There's different types. In the Cold War, we see loads of weird ones made. But basically, in this period, the idea is that you can drop something which is in cloud form, doesn't hang around too long, and is incredibly lethal. And so you can basically drop it into an area. And unlike mustard, which once you've coated an area, you don't be walking through that.
And these are a spin-off of pesticide. The Germans really did it was a pesticide. And then someone from the military spotted someone in IG Farben and went,
"That's right.
Can we have a look at that, please?"
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so there's a fascinating history of how this relationship was fostered between the Germans and their industry. And in the UK, you had a similar, different setup. So many of these candidate chemicals were often discarded because they were so toxic and completely useless for what you were going to use them for. The problem was that I think there was this competition, and you certainly had people in the interwar periods sort of campaigning. So you have individuals, writing polemics about how important it is to pursue chemical weapons and how, explosives would never be developed beyond what they were then, whereas chemistry had this endless potential to, and of course, this idea of, somehow chemical warfare being this decisive wonder weapon, a cleaner, higher form of killing, and all these sorts of things. And this all comes out of basically the fact that you have these chemical warfare agencies who are trying to find their way post First World War. They don't want to be abandoned. And so there's this competition for resources. So then in Germany, of course, the common conception is this idea that Hitler was opposed to chemical warfare and biological warfare. And of course, he was employing Zyklon B, neglecting all that. I always see this purely from a kind of more strategic perspective. It was a capability they had that was basically the cost of employing it. It would not have been worthwhile. So if you look at some of the historians of this area as well, you've also got, remember, the Soviets. And so for me, I think the way to think this through is to look at Stalingrad and look in particular at the extent to which neither chemical or biological weapons were employed to break that deadlock. And that for me would have been the candidate city in which, or the candidate sort of set piece conflict where you'd have gone, this is
breaks a stalemate, almost like the First World War. You've kind of got a repeat of how do we get over this impasse. That would get you over the impasse, and potentially, presumably, the Russians don't have a big chemical industry and wouldn't be as prepared. So you could get away.
Yeah, no, I'm not familiar with the extent of the Soviet stocks, but they definitely had a dedicated program in this era. Ironically, there were allegations of biological warfare at Stalingrad, and it's strange that actually this was, we think, spurious, but that story about Stalingrad kind of did live on in the Russian military. This idea that somehow there'd been something untoward had happened, and so in fact, one of the individuals that would later become the head of the Soviet biological warfare program, which became this behemoth in the Cold War, his first kind of entrance into this was when a university professor gave him this task to go and look at this suspicious disease outbreak at Stalingrad and say, was this accidental, or was this something that was done? And so, so there is that there. And of course, what's fascinating is that, and telling about much of this with the nuclear programs, that following the Second World War, you have the Nuremberg trials, and many chemists who had been involved in human experimentation had been involved in the chemical warfare programs, much like the rocket engineers were swept up when they were taken in, and they continued to work at Western universities for decades afterwards. And of course, they helped advance the Western chemical weapons programs. There was some initial resistance, in fact, to this. So there's this, if you look at the history of Portendown, so immediately after the Second World War, you have this scramble across Germany to go and find these sites where chemical weapons were being produced and stockpiled and tested, and then get hold of samples of this stuff and bring it back to test and see what it was. They didn't know what this stuff was. They assumed it was a blister agent like mustard. So they give it to volunteers. They put it on the skin of these volunteers. Isn't that it shows the classic symptoms of an incredibly powerful nerve agent, dilated pupils, low breathing, headache. And then they're like, oh, actually, no, this is probably not a blister agent. It's probably a nerve agent, but it's not as good as the one we've got. So we probably shouldn't worry. And it's only as they mess about with this more, they start to realize actually how powerful sarin is as an agent. And then they at least are a little bit more careful with the human trials they do with that agent. They continue to use it up into at least past the 50s in human trials, small dosage to see how the experiments part of exposure tests in Britain in particular. But yeah, so this was the reality after the war, because of course the concern was that the Nazis, they could have stuck that on a V2 weapon, and it would have been an incredible terror weapon to employ. And so that was something that's luckily never came to pass.
What surprised me is where I made a note somewhere. There's 180,000 employees of, is it Montan, the German chemicals company? An enormous amount of people working in the chemicals producing this stuff, and presumably this is all, if I say resource intensive, what I mean is it's speciality resource intensive. So again, it's soaking up resources that are precious and could be used elsewhere, but very specific, materials.
What's interesting, and there's a wonderful historian who's wrote on this. He describes this idea that we often, when we look back on the Second World War, we often almost assume that out of some sense of moral duty, in Europe at least, you have this kind of collective realization that pursuing chemical or biological weapons would be a bad idea, and that somehow it doesn't happen. But then in reality, you look at the history and it could have been incredibly, incredibly different. And things may have, changed. I mean, it's where we were firebombing cities, and ironically, the relationship between incendiary weapons and chemical weapons is quite close in some areas. Things like white phosphorus, which is an issue that we talk about today quite often. I mean, luckily today, I think it's really important that culturally we remember this as something that even Hitler wouldn't use, except for the caveat, of course, that chemically was employed a barbaric way to kill millions of people. But this lasting image of kind of the old order somehow not managing not to utilize chemical or biological weapons, but we use nuclear weapons that are still used and those sorts of things. So yeah, I mean, this is what's interesting, and I think, had the war gone on longer, which of course, this is the game that everyone plays, isn't it? But, had the war gone on longer, would we have seen these weapon systems utilised? Had the outcome of the Second World War been less decisive in certain areas? Would we have seen insurgency and counter-insurgency operations that employ these weapon systems? It's not quite clear to me. But yeah, it is fascinating. And what, of course, is fascinating is the legacy of this era is the fact that, so some of these weapon systems were taken. So you had certain stocks, you had small amounts of stocks in Germany of these weapons. And the British went, right, we'll have them. we're going to take them back, and we're going to have them as our deterrent. Because Britain at this point wasn't producing at scale. It was quite expensive and politically sensitive at the end of the Second World War even to do this. And so they bring these weapon systems back. They dump them at the end of an airfield somewhere, forget about them for 10 years, sit there and rust. And there's a recent history where a guy's gone around looking at all these Second World War or 1950s chemical weapons sites, which are basically largely forgotten and abandoned. And these are the silos where they kept chemical munitions, which occasionally still just turn up, particularly nerve agents, right? You can't smell them. So you only know they're leaking when your eyes go funny. And by that time, you're in real trouble. I mean, that sounds like trite, but if you're working there, that's the reality of it. You're not, you do your levels all you want, but basically you don't trust it. You shouldn't trust it. So this stuff was often put somewhere out of the way and left, and then slowly became more and more unusable and more unstable until at some point something was dealt with. And of course, back in these days, sometimes this stuff was dumped at sea. So yeah, you do have these old sites dotted around the UK, which performed this role, usually airfields, where they stockpiled.
Presumably, they just didn't centralise it in cases A, the central place gets bombed, or B, there's an accident and wipes it all out. So you just have to have these huge stockpiles all over the place. I
think that's right. And certainly, into the Cold War, there was this idea that when you were going to employ these weapon systems, so mustard in particular is a very good way of knocking out an airfield for a few days or for longer. And so there's the Cold War. This is where mustard was going to be used. You basically send out sorties. No one's flying a plane off the airfield for a few weeks, right? And so this would have been an idea. I assume this would have been part of the strategy. Would have been that you could have utilised this not as a terror weapon, but also potentially to slow down incoming planes. But so this was, I think, why it was so distributed. So that I think is really interesting about it. The fact that you still have this almost forgotten history, and it is because no one talks about it, right? Everyone has someone in their family that was there at D-Day or was on the bombers, but very few people, say, I knew someone, they were in the chemical weapons corps or they were in this unit. It was not something
but everyone's aware because it's so iconic, is the gas mask in its little cardboard box. Any film about the war that shows the home front has everybody wearing their little cardboard box with their gas mask in. Which is interesting, but it never really gets. It's just part of the costume of the time. It's not really dealt with.
Yeah, and very often that's how the history of chemical weapons in the Second World War is taught. It starts and ends there. For me, the really interesting stuff is this dash to secure the kind of the Nazi programs. The Russians and the West, of course, were very eager to get there first. The Americans and the British competed to get there as well. And today you can read up on these, the sites and the interrogations of the individuals involved with them. And you can get a sense of the type of information they were trying to get from these productions. And in the 50s in the UK, for example, they were toying with the idea of a larger production capability, which would have drawn upon the knowledge they got from the Nazi programs. And of course, the other thing is that you have Porton Down. Of course, the history of this organisation, can be traced back to the First World War.
So Porton Down's the big British chemical weapons centre, isn't it? And it is. Is it start in the First War, Porton Down?
Yeah, it's established in the First World War as a testing station for munitions, and establishes itself as a site to test and develop chemical munitions. You get a lot of smoke and mirrors. So we just talked about how the Germans developed their nerve agent program in part because they assumed that the UK and the US had a nerve agent program. But it turns out they didn't, or at least it wasn't very good. Likewise, during the First World War, there was some claims and some evidence that the Germans experimented with weapons directed at horses and cattle, particularly pack animals. And anthrax is a candidate agent for that. And it's, as you know, anthrax forms spores. They're very stable, which means they're quite good to utilize in the weapon system. They can lay dormant in places, but basically you put them on the ground and very quickly anything that's grazing in that area is going to develop the disease. So the UK were like, right. So Portland decided to develop 5 million. And again, this is not the mainstream history, right? So we forget about this because it didn't happen in the Second World War. The States didn't use biological and chemical weapons. But if the UK, Portland down, did 5 million anthrax cattle cakes, which were to be utilized and dropped over German territories should the situation appropriate for that arise.
I wonder what the appropriate situation would have been to trigger that.
Yeah, so one assumes it would be retaliatory, but also assumes I can only see that context in which I would, claim the Germans had done the same thing. Now, what is particularly interesting is, so of course, as part of developing this anthrax capability, the UK needed to understand the agent and how to use it as a weapon. So they looked for various sites in which they could do anthrax field trials. And usually the anthrax field trials involves you get the anthrax, you get a small explosive charge, not too big, and you get a puff, and then the spores blow over. You come back a day or so later, you see what's died. And usually you'd have sheep or cows or goats, sometimes monkeys. Now, of course, if you do that, you're going to contaminate the ground, and you're going to do that for a very long time. And so the UK found this site, Gurnard, off the west coast of Scotland. And so they started utilising this site in secret. If I remember right, they leased it off someone or bought it off somebody who didn't have too many questions. And they started doing these trials. Now, these were supposed to be secret. Okay, this was supposed to be like top secret. And it was completely top secret as long as you never read the local press in that area. The best example, which is talked about in Brian Balmer's book, was this idea that basically how this happened. We have the notes on this, which are various. I'll come back to that in a moment. Basically, one of the sheep trials, they decide we're going to test the exposure of this anthrax to the sheep. So we're going to do what we normally do, get the sheep all lined up on this thing, put the explosive charge down, light the explosive charge, poof, thanks very much, come back. Now, they got the charge wrong on one of the experiments. This is the general consensus. As a consequence, one of the sheep seemingly got blown into the sea and washed up on shore, and then infected animals on the mainland. So all of a sudden you've got farmers in Western Scotland all of a sudden experiencing anthrax in areas they've never had anthrax before. Now, you get naturally occurring anthrax in certain parts of the world, but there it would have certainly been would have raised suspicions. I think it's fair. Consistently, imagine they've been hearing pops off out to sea for a few months and seeing a lot of military vehicles and blokes in suits walking around. And as you can see, you actually find local interviews from the 60s and 70s of these farmers talking about how, well, we knew what was going on. We got paid money, when things happened. They'd often denied it was them. The best one was the local military claimed that foreign sailors who were transporting sheep around up to the Scarpa Flow, we assume, had inappropriately disposed of an anthrax infected sheep. They aren't buying that in that part of the world, but it was like, okay, is that the story? You sure? Fine. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Great. So it was the foreign sailors doing this. Fine. But anyway, and likewise, there was other things during during the Second World War, monkey trials in particular were a favourite, where you get hold of some monkeys and do experiments. In the 40s and 50s, I read somewhere this idea, one of my favourite lines, which was, we had a lab escape of the monkeys. We caught most of them. Now, I've never, the word most of them do so much work in a sentence, in an official report of an accident. But you see this quite a lot, and this is something which unfortunately would continue. So Portland had some great scientists there, and it had some very committed people, and it was working in a dire situation. But there's ethical problems with open air trials, and human trials, in particular animal trials, would continue, and of course would be something which now Portland is remembered for, because in the 60s and 70s and 80s this issue really came to a head, and you saw huge public resistance to the work going on there. But this all could be traced back to this initial period where it became established.
I remember Anthrax Island for some reason being in the news when I was a kid.
Yeah, so they finally cleared it up. I think it was like in the 2000s, they finally declared it as like...
Because it'd been completely no-go, hadn't it? There's signs up all over it.
Anthrax doesn't mess about, and it stays there. You put it there, it stays in the ground. And so they did a huge decontamination operation, and then eventually it was given the status of being safe. And of course it is safe now. It has been decontaminated, but that was for years. And of course this was at the beginning of a period where the UK started, after here they were kind of like, well, this is a bit too close to home. You don't want sheep washing up on shore. So they decided that they're going to start doing more sea trials, and they collaborated with the US post-Second World War and Canada, and started doing some sea trials far out to sea in different parts of the world. And there was incidents there as well, very comparable. But this all comes out of that period. And the strange thing is that chemical and biological weapons they came out of the Second World War. They again developed a strategic deterrent in some senses, but also you have this other side of them, which is more to do with their use as weapons of assassination or weapons of incapacitation, air denial, all sorts of different types. The CIA in particular became very interested in psychoactive.
Sort of more tactical use, isn't it, when you're sort of knocking out specific airfields rather than just wiping out whole populations.
Yeah, so this all comes back from that kind of period. And so, yeah, Portland just after the Second World War was a fascinating place for that reason. And there was the SOE in particular, I think they had, unfortunately, I think the records, we're not getting the records back for some of the stuff they did. As I understand it, there were potentially records that were potentially written up, but they seem to have gone. So I don't know where they are. It seems reasonable to think that there was work done on certain chemical agents, particularly as improvised weapons, in the event of a invasion, which would seem, unexpected. Reasonable to believe that was the case.
I imagine, yes, we were trying to develop all kinds of chemical weapons for surgical strike assassination type things. Let's face it, the Russians do it now. Why were SOE not thinking of the same thing?
Yeah, so there is certainly discussion of that and poison pills. And of course, this is the year of cyanide and those sorts of things, and cyanide pills. So yeah, poisons, toxins, weird sorts of stuff. They were definitely looking at it. Yeah, it can be to some extent traced back to the Second World War. I think that's where you saw the kind of solidification of like a modern programs. I think they came out of that period. And it's interesting that many of the weapons we still talk about today, they come from the Second World War era. Of course, there were newer nerve agents in particular, which emerged out of the Cold War. But sarin, which we still talk about, and sadly we still see used, mustard as well. I mean, the IS have utilised mustard in the Syrian conflict. These are 100-year-old plus chemical weapons. I think it's really good that the Second World War, in particular, is remembered as this kind of, it reaffirmed that these weren't acceptable weapons. And yet the flip side is that this is where you saw the establishment of the programs. So just in case sort of thing.
They kind of get a boost because I imagine the chemical weapons industry just goes, the levels of people employed must have been vast, but it's just in case. So it's never utilised, but there's the resources poured in and the manpower and everything else to deal with it.
And of course, if you've ever done military service or anything like that, it's chemical warfare training is part, and CBI is part of it. It's every generation of new soldiers is sort of reinforced. And so I think for me, there's still a lot of work to be done there. I think it is time for a retelling of that story around CB in particular in the Second World War period. I would be really interested in looking at more work which looks at kind of soldiers' experience in the preparations for the chemical warfare that never happened on the continent, particularly in the UK. So you have work that's looked, particularly there's a lot of, in the Second World War and following it, Portland became notorious for its trials involving squaddies mainly. And so there's been a lot of work looking at the experiences of soldiers who underwent exposure to things like nerve agent and those sorts of things with these laboratories. But there doesn't seem to be work that's really looked at, the history of the major chemical weapon units that were relevant for the Second World War, particularly the UK's preparations and carrying out the Second World War. I wonder why that is. I mean, I think in part it's because there is this stigma.
Presumably there must be regular army units that are trained to deploy this stuff that were put in the field and didn't do anything.
You think about the histories you've read on the mainstream histories of the Second World War, it often features as this kind of, it could have been used, or there was a fear of it, but not the fact that there was a capacity, there would have been training and infrastructure to deliver it. And so that is an area where I think there's probably good reasons why it hasn't been told. I think that it's in part because it was something that people want to forget about.
You're right. Why do we not hear the military? Where's the memoirs of the guys in these units that never did? They'll have done something, but they're ready, but never to use it. They must have had a high level of readiness as well, because if somebody uses it and you have a deterrent, you have to instantly deploy it. So they must have been there all the time with it, but not using it. It must have been a very peculiar job of a war that you're kind of not fighting.
Yeah, that's directly. Right. So that's something that I think has been buried to some extent, and it would probably merit kind of looking at. But I mean, of course, in the 20s and 30s, the people that are writing about chemical weapons, I said, on the one hand, you have your advocates for chemical warfare, the people that wanted to you saw this as the weapon of the future. And people like Haldane was a famous popular scientist, and he had some horrific views, but one of his seeming preoccupations was advocating for chemical warfare. And this idea, just because it's immoral doesn't mean we shouldn't think of it as a rational tool that could be applied in the service of. And so on the one hand, you had that. But on the other hand, you had H.G. Wells as a sci-fi writer from this era in the 1930s. He was writing about the use of chemical agents and aerial warfare and all those sorts of things. So The Shape of Things to Come, that book from that era, the sort of the mass fear about the conflict that was going to arrive during the Second World War. Yeah, these ideas, this was very much there in the public imagination. So in that respect, I think that is something which must be an uneasy history to tell.
Well, what's the cultural fear of chemical weapons? I mean, I don't ever recall reading anything about that. There must have been a huge propaganda campaign around gas masks to issue everyone with one and to force them to carry them. So at which point, what's the cultural fear that comes through?
That's right. And so I haven't seen I'm sure there must have been public. So if you think about the public information campaigns that we often get, you get the one with the white phosphorus, the incendiaries and the potato peeler and those sorts of things. That one comes to mind, but not the chemical warfare preparation videos. Because also they tend to focus on putting the mask on because it was assumed to be a nerve agent. And so I'm sure there would have been some public. There's a wealth of public information. Videos from that, from the theatre and things like that era that would be worth looking at.
Films, yeah, and posters and everything else, but it doesn't get remembered, presumably because it wasn't used. Yet, as we said at the start, it's such it's a tick on your costume of the time is the box.
Yeah, exactly right.
And also, of course, the gas mask you'd assume that must mean they were looking at, did they assume it'd be an aerial agent? Did they assume it'd be a chlorine or phosgene or a nerve agent? Because if it was mustard, the gas mask isn't, would protect you from inhaling it, but it's not going to stop the exposure to it, which can also lead to death still. So,
at which point did they just expect the mask more to be keep the public put the public's mind at rest rather than something that's practical, especially if they're not sitting there explaining how to put them on properly?
Yeah, and I guess the good barometer is like war films. So if I think about it, I can think of war films where like you talk about like heavy water and getting hold of various nuclear related things. There was a race to get hold of the chemical weapons program, and I can never recall chemical weapons featuring I can't think of a film other than the gas mask as a kind of trope in popular Second World War film. I can't think of where have I seen any of the people there in their Technicolor holding or wearing a gas mask. You often see like the orderly coming in holding it, or like the someone running past holding a gas mask. But it's not something which is seen to be,
or it's something temporarily put on to hide behind.
Yeah.
As a sort of a costume, or used in a confined space because of a fire. I'm thinking about, is there maybe one in Dad's boot or something like that where there's something in here? But I can't. You're right. There doesn't have any general use other than everyone has one. And I think as well the other thing that from that point of view, where they do get shown, is there's always a big thing about the baby gas mask, that kind of big thing. But that's shown more because it's the horror and the totality of war to demonstrate that even babies needed gas masks, rather than to demonstrate that they were never actually used. But war so totally affects the babies. But we never needed them. But they never tell you they never needed them. It's there. What will be, you've got me thinking now, what will be fascinating if you think of any war movie, every civilian has a gas mask. I wonder if you look at pictures of civilians throughout the war, if they're still all got the gas masks. I mean, I could see them all having them in 39, but do they all still have them in 44?
And certainly in the kind of ones that, the set piece photographs, they're often there.
Yeah.
I mean, particularly the child holding the mask in one hand, a teddy bear in the other, usually.
But what year is that from? Is that from 40? Are we still doing those pictures by 44?
Yeah. The other curiosity I've had, which sounds a bit strange, is where did all the masks go afterwards? Was there like a mass recycling program? Where did they all end up? So, I mean, I say this now because if you look around you, I don't know if you looked around, it's like near you, but the world is awash with these little paper disposable masks from the pandemic. And so it makes me wonder, I see most of these things just went into people's lofts and stayed there because I guess it's one of those things where you'll think, well, just in case, I'll keep that upstairs somewhere.
I mean, there is undoubtedly, they're still not expensive to buy, and I suspect the market's been wildly affected by the fact that you're not allowed to wear them now because the filters are full of asbestos. When I was a kid, we just wandered about with them on, World War II gas masks. I've got one. And it was just what you did. I've got a gas mask, you stick it on, and then by the early 90s, you were told not to put them on because they were full of asbestos. But we spent hours sitting in at gas masks, World War II gas masks as kids.
Just simpler times, yeah. But yeah, that's why I find it interesting. There's also things like there was a Italian ship that was blown up that had mustard in it. That was the most major fatalities and deaths caused by mustard in the Europe, at least. There was a ship that was blown up, and you can still read about that. So there are these weird incidental stories. There must have been dozens and dozens of accidents as well. Mustard was.
There must be the production.
Yeah. So this stuff is horrifically bad. And the other thing is, again, this might be something that was talked about, but it isn't really talked about. It would amaze me if following the Second World War, there wasn't claims of industrial related illnesses stemming from, and again, this might be in the history, and people of a certain generation might even remember this, but
That seems to have been.
Well, you get all the nuclear trials where people have subsequently sued decades later.
Yeah, but I guess I mean more. Yeah, people on like actual production facilities where they're breathing in stuff, like in armament factories and stuff like that. And so there might be good reasons for this, but it strikes me that again that connection is not there, right? Again, so with bomb production, with conventional, you have the images of the people putting these bombs together.
The sarin works were very problematic with people being ill because it's difficult to make. So it must be the same for most of the chemical. Because sails in 1940, your rubber sails are not as good as what we have now. It's a completely different kettle of fish.
No, and the production of most of the stuff that you put into it is pretty bad before you make it. Like it's not like you put in water one end and hydrogen the other, and you get out this super toxic compound. The intermediaries are pretty nasty as well, and the tails you get from the production, as in like the waste products. It's horrible the whole way through. So, I mean, that's something that, again, isn't really talked about. You have the images of people making munitions and working in bomb factories. And there would have also been individuals working in the maintenance and production of chemical weapons in the UK, but that, again, isn't something that's... I think it was a small intellectual aspect of it, but I just think it's interesting. It's one of those parts of the history which... there doesn't seem to be a way into it. It doesn't seem to be something that is there already in the public imagination. And it's one of those things that once you think about it, you think, well, obviously that should be something that is there, but that story is not really told. And I'm sure there have been works in the 50s and 60s written on it, but certainly the past 30 years or so, it's not really, it's not. I think at the moment, particularly with events in the world, this might be a good time to revisit the UK history. I have a colleague who worked, for example, on sort of the Portland Down trials in the 50s and 60s and some of the open air stuff they did. And that history is fascinating. But again, I mean, I'm from Wiltshire. And so you had these open air trials, this is like in the 2000s, people. So this happened in the 50s and 60s, but the story really broke in the 2000s. And this is 20 years ago. And this is my field, and I didn't make that connection and realize it until much more recently than it perhaps should have been, because it was just something which is they're talked about for a while. Unless a broader story keeps them alive, they're dropped and forgotten about. And so I think that's quite an interesting aspect of it as well.
Well, as we move away from the war, that would seem like a good place to finish. Thanks, loyal listener. If you can think of any Second World War movies featuring chemical weapons, or if someone in your family was in the army trained to deploy chemical weapons during the war, Brett would love to hear from you. You can find him on Twitter at BWI Edwards, and don't forget to check out his podcast, Poisons and Pestilence. Hopefully next time out for the 80th anniversary, we'll be looking at the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Well, that's all from me for now. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.